Sitting between Millsville and Scotsburn in Pictou County, Fitzpatrick Mountain sits atop the Cobequid mountain range. Now, passing through former agricultural land and signs of changing times like this wind turbine, the Fitzpatrick Mountain Trail is part of the Cape to Cape Trail, and it's where I'm on my walkabout today. The Fitzpatrick Mountain Trail runs from a seasonal parking lot near New Road and Grant Road pretty much to the Trans-Canada Trail, where it passes the Scotsburn Fire Department, a distance of around 8 kilometers. I've decided to start near the peak of Fitzpatrick Mountain at another seasonal parking area and head downhill towards Scotsburn, a distance of around 6 kilometers. At times of the year or during bad weather, when the seasonal parking areas aren't accessible, you can also start your hike at Weeks Quarry on the 6-mile Brook Road, where there is a former trailhead with a map and kiosk. That starting point would have you begin on the 6-mile Brook Trail, which by itself is a 10.5-kilometer loop and goes on to connect to the Dalhousie Mountain Trail. You know, the wind turbines on Fitzpatrick Mountain are operated by different groups of investors under different sorts of energy agreements. The place where I started is actually called the Two Towers Lookoff, which I presume refers to the two larger towers. Since that was named, more towers have been installed, and they range in size from very small turbines to ones up to 1,600 kilowatts. This range of mountains is a popular spot for harnessing wind energy. In the distance towards the south of here are Dalhousie Mountain and Mount Tom, both of which host many more turbines. These mountains are windy, making them a great home for wind energy. They're also a great home for a 400-kilometer trail. I've hiked many parts of the Cape to Cape Trail. Now, that trail is intended to go from Cape Chignecto in Cumberland County to Cape George in Antigonish County, and it was the vision of Gordon Young, a Pictou County resident, in 2003. The trail is still under development, and the Fitzpatrick Mountain Trail is part of that vision. Now, as this trail crosses the ridge, it also crosses the site of an almost forgotten but epic Indigenous battle. By the late 1600s, before Europeans arrived on this mountain, the Mi'kmaq and the Mohawk warriors were at war. While at one time the two groups had lived in peace, this was a time when each group was attacking each other's villages. Each of the indigenous groups had formed alliances with others. The Mi'kmaq had joined with the Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, Abenaki, and Penobscot to form the Wabanaki Confederacy in the early 1600s. The Mohawk became part of the Iroquois-Mohawk Confederacy. The Battle of Fitzpatrick Mountain came about when Mi'kmaq chief Arrowhead chose this place to push back against the Mohawk warriors and their allies, led by Chief Grey Wolf. Chief Grey Wolf brought his forces out of the woods to attack the Mi'kmaq on the ridge at a clearing where they thought those forces would be. The story goes that the air became full of arrows and a violent and bloody battle ensued. Mi'kmaq warriors appeared to be successful in taking out their enemy. A truce was called as night fell, something common in Indigenous battles of the day. But this truce also allowed the Mohawk to regroup and withdraw. Chief Grey Wolf moved some of his warriors to go around to the other side of the mountain in order to attack from behind. But Chief Arrowhead saw this, and the Mi'kmaq were able to surprise the Mohawk force attempting the sneak attack. So what's important to understand about this battle is it was taking place on a part of this mountain that overlooked a steep drop-off. By this point, Chief Arrowhead and his Mi'kmaq forces had surrounded, in sort of a semicircular shape, the Mohawk forces of Chief Grey Wolf. The only way out was over the cliff for the Mohawk. At this point, Chief Grey Wolf realized his strategy had a fatal mistake. His forces were pushed off the edge by the Mi'kmaq forces, and most of them were killed. Chief Grey Wolf himself was captured as a prisoner of war. Some Mohawk warriors did survive and made the long trek home. The Mohawk wanted revenge. They wanted their chief back. While many wanted retaliation for the loss, it was ultimately decided to try and negotiate a truce and the return of Chief Grey Wolf. But their attempts were rejected. Grey Wolf's daughter, Fawn, and her brother went to the Pictou Mi'kmaq camp in person to plead for his release. So what happened next is a little bit of a twist in this story. Mi'kmaq Chief Arrowhead did agree to meet with Fawn, and in fact they met over a couple of weeks. Initially, he was very reluctant to release Chief Grey Wolf. But then they fell in love. Now, you have to understand that a marriage between the Mi'kmaq and the Mohawk at that time would have been something out of Romeo and Juliet. The families like the Montagues and the Capulets, and it could have ended very much the same way. But Chief Arrowhead and Chief Grey Wolf were very influential in their communities. And despite the fact that the tribes were very reluctant at first, they were able to convince them to allow the marriage, and the marriage happened, and peace came. And there was an intertribal peace agreement between the Mohawk and the Mi'kmaq. Hostilities had come to an end. One of the great things about this trail, especially if you're not familiar with the area and maybe a little nervous, is at all the intersections you'll find signs like this. This tells me that Scotsburn is that way, and that's where I'm headed. Well, I'm now off the plateau of the mountain and working my way down the other side towards Scotsburn. When those Indigenous battles happened, this mountain would certainly have had a different name than Fitzpatrick. Well, after the break, I'm going to be heading past the land of the man whose name this mountain now remembers. Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine. Well, I'm on the Fitzpatrick Mountain Trail, part of the Cape to Cape Trail Network, and I have reached the turnoff for Smith Rock Chalets. It's another access point along this trail, and one that's very popular with mountain bikers and with hikers. I'm on my way to Scotsburn. One of the attractions for staying in this area is the trail, and not just for hikers, but also mountain bikers. Bikers call this trail the original Fitz, and the portion I started on, they call the Cape to Cape to the Windmills, for obvious reasons. But there are many, many other mountain bike routes which cross this hiking trail, so it's always important to keep an eye out for the Cape to Cape trail signs, so you know you're on the right route. Well, as I reach this part of the hike, I'm very close to the Fitzpatrick Mountain Road, which is the main driving access to reach the Smith Rock Chalets. Now, I'm headed towards Scotsburn, and in the last 2 kilometers or so of this hike, I'm crossing into land that was once owned by James Fitzpatrick. It's about 118 acres on the bottom half of this mountain, and that's the person this mountain is named for today. James Fitzpatrick was born in 1744 in Ireland. He married there and had 3 children, though it seems both his wife and children died in Ireland. He would marry again in New Jersey, where he had a daughter. But both the daughter and that wife died before he moved to Nova Scotia. When he arrived on this mountain, it already had a name, Rogers Hill. He was 60 years old, and it was the early 1800s when he married for a 3rd and final time. He married Janet Murray of nearby Scotsburn, who was almost 30. When they married, they could barely understand each other. Janet's family were Protestants from Sutherlandshire, Scotland, where they spoke Scottish Gaelic. James, being from Ireland, was Roman Catholic and spoke Irish Gaelic. They had 6 children. While Fitzpatrick Mountain was, of course, later renamed to Fitzpatrick, the Rogers Hill name still remains. To the south of here are two small communities, one called Rogers Hill and one called the Rogers Hill Crossroads. The origins of the name Fitzpatrick are more unique than you might expect. Fitzpatrick is the only Irish surname that begins with Fitz. All other names beginning with Fitz, like Fitzgibbons or Fitzgerald, are Norman in origin. It's believed that Fitz, with the Irish name Patrick, was adopted at the time of the Anglo-Norman invasion in Ireland in 1172. The Fitzpatricks were granted land by the Earl of Pembroke, and the Fitzpatricks were originally McGillpatricks, which in Gaelic means son of the servant or devotee of St. Patrick. Well, land ownership in this area has obviously changed since the time of James Fitzpatrick. Most of the land that this trail crosses is privately owned, and a little bit of it is public. Colin Murray owns land near the start of this trail if you were leaving from Scotsburn traveling in the opposite direction to me. Other owners include Derek Gammon, Dave Gunn, and Tommy Matheson. There are a number of other landowners as you move along who kindly allow people to use this trail network across their land. James Fitzpatrick died at the age of 103 in 1847. His wife, Janet, died 14 years later at the age of 86 in 1861. They're both buried nearby at St. John's Cemetery. That cemetery also played home until 1907 for St. John's Church of Scotland. Buried in a plot marked by one of the largest monuments in the cemetery, the inscription reads, "In memory of James Fitzpatrick, who departed this life on the 18th day of November, 1847. He was a native of Ireland, County Monaghan. He immigrated to this port, where he spent the remaining part of his days and died in peace with all men, aged 103 years. Also, Janet Murray, his wife, who died 28th December, 1861, aged 86 years." These stone walls I've seen everywhere marked property boundaries or the edge of fields that had been cleared. And it's right around here that James Fitzpatrick's 118 acres was located. I've now reached the community of Scotsburn, which has a population of about 5,500 people. In a few hundred meters, I'll reach Scotsburn Park, which is pretty much the end of this hike. If you're familiar with Scotsburn dairy products, this is where the name comes from, and is also the headquarters for the cooperative, which is the largest independent dairy company in Atlantic Canada. And just across the road from the end of this trail is Scotsburn Lumber, where you'll find one of the largest sawmills in Nova Scotia. Also around the end of this section of trail is A Walk Through Time Museum, which is a great opportunity to see a general store laid out from the year 1900, with products that would be familiar to those who lived on the land that this trail now goes through, as well as many tools from the trade, from doctors to workers, that made this community tick over the years. From here, you can pick up the Trans-Canada Trail just across the street behind the fire hall. It will take you either towards Amherst or Pictou. This section is known as the Jitney Connector. You can also take the Trans-Canada to another part of the Cape to Cape network, the Durham Hill Trail. Well, this marks the end of this hike. However, had I traveled in the other direction on the Cape to Cape network, I would have ended up in the Gully Lake Wilderness area. There's a number of wonderful trails through there, including the Earltown Lake and Portage Trail. And that's where I'm headed after the break.
Come on, won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
Well, 100 meters or so from the entrance to Sugar Moon Farm, and incidentally some really great pancakes and maple syrup, you'll find the entrance to the Earltown Lakes and Portage Trails. Those trails take you past blueberry fields, raspberry patches, lakes, and the shadow of mountains all the way to the Gully Lake Wilderness area. And it's here on the Earltown Lakes portion of the trail that I'm on my walkabout today. After heading off the 311, the trail starts on land once granted to Paul MacDonald and Janet McKay. They would have been among the first settlers in Earltown around 1817. The property has been held in the family ever since. There are a lot of MacDonald homesteads in this area, all coming from Rogart, Scotland. In fact, just across the highway next to Sugar Moon Maple Syrup Farm, you'll find Rogart Mountain and many more of the former homesteads. This is Rovey Hill. It's named for a particular hamlet in Scotland called Rovey, where a type of small-scale food production and land ownership was common, a type that was particular to the Scottish Highlands. Crofting is a type of farming done on poor farmland where small townships work together to try and get what they can from the land. It's actually still regulated and exists in Scotland today. Often farmers would have been tenant farmers with no ownership, so coming to Nova Scotia was fairly attractive. The chance to own your own plot here was something that would have been unachievable for many in Scotland. Well, land in this area was granted to Robert Nolan Marsters at the age of 25 in 1815. Now, he didn't live very long. He actually passed away at the age of 55, after which, around 1860, the land was taken over by the Frasers. Now, the Frasers operated mills along the lake at that time. For much of the 20th century, the land has been held in the Marshall family. This grassy area next to me is what's called a vernal pool. Now, vernal pools are sometimes full of water and they're sometimes dry. And as such, they're habitats for very specific types of plants and animals. In particular, plants and animals that like that really wet, but can also survive when it's dry. Salamanders are a great example of that sort of animal. These areas are also great habitats for migrating birds because the soils beneath those grasses can be full of invertebrates, which make for excellent meals. This particular pool is called George's Vernal Pool, after George MacDonald, who received this land in 1814 and was officially granted it in 1824. George was also from Rogart, Scotland, like so many who settled in this area. He would ultimately move to Pictou, but the land stayed in his family until the 1950s. As George was also the first cousin to Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. Well, this is the Earltown Lake. Now, at one time, it was actually called MacDonald Lake, and you can pretty much guess why. So many MacDonalds owned property around it. In the 1800s and early 1900s, this lake was surrounded by sawmills. There's not much left to indicate they were ever here nowadays. On the other side of the lake, just behind the trees, is the Kemptown Road. Now, in 1874, Alex Sutherland Kempton operated a blacksmith shop and sawmill along there, and that's how the road got its name. Around 1905, John Logan purchased much of the land in this area and negotiated 99-year leases with other landholders so he could raise the height of this lake by 10 feet. That way he could operate a woodworking mill much more effectively. In 1928, the dams he built were taken over by a local power corporation, but in December of that year, the dam broke, destroying every single bridge from here to Tatamagouche, including a swinging bridge some children used to get to school in West Earltown. It was that raising of the lake that turned the area near me into an island. Well, this is Taylor Lake, and like so many of the roads, lakes, and other natural features around here, it's named for one of the original land grantees in this area, John Taylor. He got 100 acres just across the lake in 1891. Now, some of the land that he had been granted back then is now home to cottages. Well, a literal crossroads. If I go left, that would be the Taylor Lake Road or the Taylor Road, depending which map you look at. And 4 kilometers that way will take you to the village of Earltown and the Earltown Cemetery. Going this way is a continuation of the Earltown Lake Trail. However, it's worth noting that if you go back to 1819, this route appears on maps as an old road. I'm going to be going this way, which will take me through blueberry fields, through some homesteads, and eventually back to the Kemptown Road. As I head along this trail, I continue following old land grants from the 1800s. The original land grants along this part of the road were issued primarily around 1819 and 1820. Well, in the spring, this valley will fill with water, and the water runs down to Salmon River, which is in the Gully Lake Wilderness area. This trail that I'm hiking today is entirely outside of the wilderness area until you reach the end at the Portage Trail. Sir Richard Burton once said, "The gladdest moment in life is a departure into unknown lands." And that's exactly what the experience would have been for those new arrivals from Rogart, Scotland, full of trepidation, of fear, opportunity, and of course, adventure. Well, I hope wherever your next walkabout finds you, that it takes you onto a journey into unknown lands.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Hey, come on, feel the sunshine.